The Best of Our Knowledge explores topics on learning, education, and research. Coming up, researchers are using artificial intelligence to listen in on the world of insects. Periodical cicadas this spring are singing in enormous numbers across the U.S. It's a reunion hundreds of years in the making. And we'll speak with young students who are exploring future careers in teaching. I'm Lucas Willard, host of The Best of Our Knowledge. This is The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. Insects rule the world, so says University of Massachusetts Amherst researcher and entomologist Laura Figueroa. Dr. Figueroa is senior author of a study published in the Journal of Applied Ecology that demonstrates how artificial intelligence can be used to detect different species of insects. Insects are arthropods, the largest phylum of Earth's animal kingdom. There are about 1 million identified species of insects on Earth, and there may be several millions more that have not yet been identified. To date, Dr. Figueroa's research has led to machine learning that can identify just over 300 different insects by sounds, whether that be listening for native beneficial pollinators or for mosquitoes that carry dangerous diseases. To learn more about insects and the field of bioacoustics, I spoke with Dr. Figueroa.
Insects really have three key areas in which they influence human society, if not more. One, they can be disease vectors. And so you mentioned mosquitoes. The Anopheles gambiae is responsible for transmitting the plasmodium that causes malaria, that causes 1 million deaths every year and estimated over 200 million cases every year. We think about agricultural pests, which have hundreds of billions of dollars in damages every year. And then, of course, there's this category of all the seemingly endless things that they do positive for human society. You mentioned pollinators, but there's also nutrient cycling, food for birds, food for aquatic environments. They're important for cultural representation and have been so for millennia. So part of why the impetus is to have really standardized ways of monitoring populations. So for the organisms that are detrimental for human society, we want to be able to catch outbreaks early. So for example, if we're in the Northeast, we have high diverse forests, we want to be able to catch outbreaks of, for example, emerald ash borer or the long-horned beetle and other types of pests that might destroy our forests. And if we have grains stored in an agricultural production, what if you're able to catch the movement of sounds of grains before there's an outbreak? Because once there's an outbreak, the only way to deal with it is either to destroy it or spray massive amounts of pesticides. But if you can catch it early, we might be able to have more targeted, sustainable interventions. And with pollinators and other beneficial insects, it's the same thing, but in reverse. So if we're able to monitor populations in a stable way and we can start catching okay, there are consistent declines in this area, we might be able to have more effective restoration efforts. We might be able to have more targeted interventions. And so part of the idea of your question of, okay, why bioacoustics? What are we doing now? So a lot of the current strategies include pitfall traps, a lot of types of physical traps that catch the insects. And the idea is that then someone has to physically process all of those samples. They have to collect the insects, they have to move them, pin them, identify them, and that's a lot of people power. And another thing is that it also just requires expertise. And the idea is, can we train automated models that leverage, for example, what we were finding, machine learning is really the way that is going forward to identify these insects on the wing, so to speak, where you could basically deploy the recorders and it could give us information about their populations in real time.
This reminds me of the bird app that some people may have on their smartphone where you can sit outside in your backyard, turn on the app, and it'll pop up with, oh, that's a chickadee you're hearing, that's a cardinal, that's a bluebird. Is there another application that you envision in the same way for insects?
Absolutely. So the app that you're referring to is the Cornell Merlin app, is one of the big ones. And actually they use neural networks. And we're using the exact same types of algorithms for the development of a bioacoustics model for monitoring bees in my lab. And that was one of the types of algorithms that was most common in this systematic review that we've undertaken. It's really kind of the way of the future, at least for the near term, because technology is always advancing. But for the current state, it's really the current gold standard.
So not everybody out there can detect the difference between the buzz of a fly and the buzz of a bee, but you can, I understand.
That's right. And I've been working in this field for a little bit over a decade. But one of the things that really blew me away was hearing about models that can detect, even for mosquitoes. There's one model that can detect 20 species of mosquitoes based on wing beat frequencies. And that's something that I, even as an entomologist, would never claim to be able to do. And for things like bees, they are more distinct. Bees are very large in size. Some of them, they're highly variable in size. Queens are quite large. Workers tend to be smaller. There are many solitary bees that tend to be much smaller. And so if there are models that can distinguish 20 species of mosquito, the reasoning is that we can definitely develop models that differentiate more distinct acoustic signals.
So there are different models that can be used under this premise of identifying insects with sound. Could you help break that down for me when we talk about machine learning models, non-machine learning models, and what's the difference and why do we need to take a look at all of the different ways that this data can actually be interpreted?
Totally. So one of the things that we did in this review is we looked at the ways in which bioacoustics has been used to monitor insects. And so we binned them in three categories: non-machine learning, machine learning, and deep learning. Non-machine learning is basically this broad umbrella term of all of the models where the researchers basically predefine what it is to be a given species. So it's basically when it reaches this frequency, you're species of cricket X. When you're this other frequency, you're species of cricket Y. And so there is a knowledge of the system and a predetermination of this is the distinctive feature. Machine learning, on the other hand, it is not predefined by the programmer. Basically, we train these models to train themselves. What we basically do is provide sufficiently labeled data of giving enough examples of grasshopper X and grasshopper Y, and it basically trains itself. And we don't actually know what features the model has determined to be salient and to be characteristics of these species, but it ends up just, we basically have to get the output. So we give enough training data, and then we test and see what proportion does it get correctly. And so we don't know what specific elements it picks up, but we do know how effective it is. And at the end, part of why this is so powerful is that they can have incredibly high levels of accuracy, of precision, and of recall when trained with sufficiently large data sets.
And it almost seems impossible if you're out in an open area in the summertime, say at twilight, and you're listening, there's probably millions of insects that you're hearing, and it sounds more of a cacophony or a loud one noise, not individual noises. But could you give me a sense of how exact these models can be in actually identifying a particular species of fly versus a grasshopper versus a cricket versus a bee?
Totally. So we found that there are models that are really effective for detection and some for classification. The difference is detection is, are you finding fly versus no fly? And classification is, can you tell fly X from fly Y, from grasshopper X, for example? And so it's a way of differentiating and classifying. And some of these models are really tremendously able to differentiate among many, many different groups. I think the highest one had over 100 species that it could differentiate among. And another thing that when you were mentioning the twilight, there's a lot of species, we found evidence of also something called acoustic indices. So instead of just identifying one specific group, they take information from the grasshoppers, from even other types of animals like bird calls, and then they create these indices of acoustic complexity that are correlated with the well-being of a given environment. And so sometimes it's differentiating or presence of absence of a specific species, and sometimes it's knowing that really healthy environments have a broad diversity of types of insect sounds. So you can do many different kinds of things with bioacoustics.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question is where do you see this technology going next, and what other kinds of animals or non-animals do you think this technology could be used to listen for?
So some of the ways in which actually it has primarily been used up to this point is with vertebrates. So you mentioned the Merlin bird app. There's a lot of research on birds. There's actually really, really interesting work on elephants as well, and leveraging our understanding of bioacoustics for monitoring even gunshots. And so for effective management of poaching. So if you can train a model, what are the sounds that elephants make when they're in distress? What is the sound of a gunshot? And so that those can be placed throughout different reserves to pinpoint, okay, there's evidence for poaching, we need to have really targeted interventions. But in terms of insects, because they're so ecologically important for so many different parts of the environment, I see future directions as we need more integration between the programmers and with practitioners, because a lot of what we were finding in the review was the development of models, and there are these, oh, we've developed this model, we have really high accuracy, we can differentiate among these things. And then where does it go? It actually doesn't really go anywhere because the data are either not made available, or if they're made available, it would require high levels of expertise in programming or in computer languages that not everyone speaks. And so what I really see as the direction forward is we need to combine the expertise of the system, we need to combine the practitioner knowledge, and develop user interfaces that enable people who actually care about either promoting pollinators, protecting rainforests, and thinking about katydids and other types of singing insects, those who are in agriculture, that are worried about disease vectoring, that all of those can come together so that we can actually use this for the common good.
I'm imagining a mapping tool where we can see maybe an invasive species, its movement over years that's generated through bioacoustics.
Exactly. So I think one of the things that I'm really interested in with the work that we're doing in my lab with bees in particular is that we'll be able to monitor at larger spatial scales and also in locations that we might not otherwise be able to easily access. So for example, trees and other locations. And so then you could create these kinds of maps, these other kinds of information about where the bees are present and where they are not. And I want to emphasize that this is one tool in a diversified toolkit. In no way am I saying bioacoustics is the only way. It's not going to replace all the other types of monitoring. It has certain limitations, but I think it can really be complementary and give us a really additional element of monitoring, especially the insects that have the most distinct acoustic signals.
Dr. Laura Figueroa is an entomologist and assistant professor of environmental conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is senior author of the study From Buzzes to Bites, a systematic review of automated bioacoustics models used to detect, classify, and monitor insects, published in the Journal of Applied Ecology. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. Let's stick around in the noisy world of insects for a while.
This is the song of the periodical cicada, commonly called the 17-year locust. It has been heard re-echoing from the walls of this stately Maryland mansion at regular 17-year intervals since 1768. This region is the home of one of the 14 broods. Brood 10 appeared last in 1936 for a few weeks in June and July. Millions of these harmless insects fill the air with their song. The shrubs and trees were covered with them, crawling, flying, and singing. By mid-July, they had disappeared.
That's from a video published in 1939 from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Motion Picture Service on the emergence of the periodical cicada. This spring, parts of the country are experiencing what's been dubbed the double brood. In Midwestern and Southern states, the 13 and 17-year cycles of two cicada broods will emerge at the same time. Trillions of flying, singing insects will reach adulthood in a rare occurrence that happens once every 221 years. One researcher paying close attention to the insect that's hard to ignore is Dr. Jason B. Oliver, a professor of entomology at Tennessee State University. Dr. Oliver lends his expertise to the nursery industry. He spoke with the Best of Our Knowledge's Jody Cowan about how tree growers are preparing for the once-in-a-lifetime double brood phenomenon.
They're called periodical cicadas because their life cycle is either basically timed for 13 years or 17 years, depending on which species you're dealing with. And so we have broods all over the United States that emerge at different timings. So, I mean, I wouldn't say every year, but there are a lot of years you could go somewhere else in the country and actually observe this same thing happening. It's just the broods have their different cycles. And the interesting thing about these broods is they're not one species. There are several species within some of these broods, but they all have either the 17-year or 13-year life history.
How do they know when it's time to come up?
Yeah, that's a good question. From my own personal reading, I've seen there's some evidence that they're using sap flow cycles in the tree to time this. I don't know if that's 100% proven, but it doesn't appear to be temperature based, and obviously it's not going to be light based because they're not counting the number of annual solar cycles for sure because they're below ground, not exposed to light. But these changing cycles of sap seems to be coordinated with that.
Is this something that climate change or anything that we're doing on the surface of the Earth here could affect what's driving them to come up faster at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just like all insects, they're going to have basically a cold-blooded or poikilothermic type of development. So that's temperature-based. That could modulate this or even possibly cause other issues with throwing their broods out of cycle at some point. It's hard to say what the ramifications of that could be. Indirectly, the effects on their host plants also could be detrimental to their development if the hosts themselves are suffering from climate induced factors.
Some of the numbers that I was reading about were kind of alarming, at least to me personally, to think about when I was thinking about 12 trillion of these insects that could potentially be coming up here, with about 404 billion cicadas that are expected in the Middle Tennessee area alone.
What's unusual this year, I think maybe what's getting a lot of attention is the brood that's emerging here in Tennessee. Brood 19 is a 13-year cicada group, and that brood is sometimes called the Great Southern Brood because it's so large. And it's actually it occupies the widest area of any of the broods. So it's going to be impacting a lot more people across the larger region. So it's getting a lot of attention for that reason. But then the other unusual thing this year is that other brood up in Illinois, that's the 17-year, the 13-year, there's a area where those overlap. So we'll have two broods emerging at the same time at that location. And that can only happen every 221 years. Basically, you multiply 13 by 17, and that's how often this happens.
What is the impact of such a large population or two potential large populations breaking ground at the same time, both on nature and on urban settings?
Biggest impacts will probably be noise level for, disruption of our events, graduation ceremonies, weddings, outdoor hikes. The sound levels could be, quite annoying and they've been instances where people can't hear very well at public events where they have a loudspeaker, but the cicadas are basically drowning out the speakers. But then the other, I guess, negative event from our perspective is the damage the females do when they lay eggs in the branches. So, she's got like a little saw-like egg-laying structure called an ovipositor, and she will make little slits in the branches to deposit her eggs. And she'll do this up and down the branch. So you'll end up with, looks like somebody's took some scissors and made little cuts on the branch, and it'll be all up and down the branch. And that usually causes the branch to die. And a lot of times the leaves will turn brown on the end, and then it will break, called flagging. And you end up with trees with all these broken branches hanging down that are brown. And, in a large forest tree, that's probably not a big problem. Those branches will eventually be shed and tree will do just fine. But if you got smaller landscaping trees, this could be, quite detrimental to the trees. And at least here in our nursery area, one of the things that they're so concerned about is it can mess up they spend a lot of time pruning and trying to get these trees into a, shade tree structural format. And then the cicadas come in and mess that all up by killing branches all over the tree canopy, and it can basically make their tree non-marketable or less marketable.
I would imagine that there's some upending of the food pyramid here a little bit in the sense of here's now, trillions of something to eat. If I'm a bird, I'm probably very happy about this. If I'm something that the bird usually eats, I'm probably very happy about this, that they have a new kind of snack to be fixated on for a little bit here. Does this create a ecological shift at all?
It would be really interesting. I've not read any reports about that. I'm just speculating. But if, things like birds have more success nesting this year because the abundance of food for them is going to be tremendous. And then after these things, the cicadas die and fall down on the ground, there's going to be a lot of other things benefiting from that. Skunks and, raccoons, and they're going to fall into streams and probably, there'll be a nutrient influx into, aquatic systems. So I don't think it's not going to be detrimental to the ecology of all these systems necessarily, but it's going to be a nutrient pulse into the system for sure.
Are there any particular studies that either you yourself are looking to conduct or that you're kind of keeping an eye on as far as this emergence and the science that might come from this?
Well, I'm going to definitely take advantage to get, more specimen samples. And I'd like to get some more examples of the damage, into our extension collections and, preserve some of the specimens. I actually don't have any videos of the males calling, so I wouldn't mind getting some of that. Research-wise, we're cooperating with Dr. Douglas Earhart at Tennessee Tech and his student, Martine Bawambi, and they're actually doing some insecticide treatments in nurseries, looking at ways to basically repel them from some of these trees that they're damaging. And I think they even have a netting study planned. So that could be interesting. I don't know, practicality wise, if you're talking thousands of acres of trees, that the netting side might be a little more of a challenge. And so we'll probably be helping them some with that. And then they will be coming back and looking at, were we successful or do we still have a lot of damage on these branches?
It seems like you're in an interesting position just in your field of the appreciation and fascination of nature, but also kind of working towards the harm that some of these creatures can do. It kind of puts you at both ends of the spectrum there when it comes to dealing with these kinds of creatures.
The ideal situation would be if we could find like a repellent or something we could put on the nursery trees that are vulnerable to damage, just make them go somewhere else. Yeah, it is a double-edged sword because we're working to manage the insects with some type of control option, but also the unique biology and nature of these insects. It's nice if we can conserve that too.
And you've mentioned some of the damage they could do to trees. Are they harmful to people? And how should we interact with them if we come across them?
Pretty much completely harmless. I mean, I think about the most that would happen to you if you pick one up. Their legs do have little spurs on them, so they might scratch you, trying to claw from your hand. But even that would probably be very minimal. Their mouth parts are mostly fused to their head. It's not something they can really bite you with. So I could see, somebody that's really afraid of insects, large buzzing insects, bees, things like that this might be terrifying to them. But yeah, they're basically harmless to us. They're going to be more detrimental to our landscape, trees, and the noise, our eardrums.
Dr. Jason B. Oliver is a research professor in the Department of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences at Tennessee State University. He spoke with the Best of Our Knowledge's Jody Cowan. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up when you were in middle school? I admit, I didn't. I don't think I figured that out until after graduating. But I recently had the chance to speak with middle and high school students who took their first steps in exploring a future career in teaching at the University at Albany in New York. For the third year, Questar 3 BOCES hosted its annual Celebration of Teaching and Learning event at UAlbany. Students in grades 8 through 12 from more than a dozen school districts across New York's capital region participated. Questar 3 BOCES Chief School Improvement Officer Terry Bordell says there are two main goals.
One, to celebrate our teachers, our educators, but also to inspire current high school students to pursue a career in education and to be inspired to do so.
The students each had their own reasons for exploring a future career in teaching. Wynetskill 8th grader Christopher Bayer says he's inspired by his mother, an educator.
I always want to thank to the teachers for an amazing job teaching us every single day, including my mom.
Eighth grader Elizabeth Chubeck, also of Wynetskill, said her work with younger kids makes her want to be an educator.
Because I've recently started babysitting for kids in my neighborhood, and it's really fun talking to them and hanging out with them and just playing games with them, and that sparked my interest for being a teacher.
The students got the chance to ask teachers outside of the classroom about their careers. Chubeck says she learned some valuable advice.
The first few years I started teaching to take it slow because it's going to be a lot, but it'll be worth it.
Maeve Clemens, an 11th grader at Averill Park High School, is also a babysitter and has worked with younger kids at Taekwondo.
It just made me realize that I can make an impact on kids' lives.
Clemens says she also learned something from the educators at the event.
I learned that teachers actually want to be there for the students, and they genuinely care about the students and the relationships that they build with them.
Tess Bates, a junior at Tamarack High School in Brunswick, wants to pursue a career in student counseling.
Part of the reason why I want to be a school counselor is because I want to help kids that need help, and I see what teachers have impacted my life as well as my friends, and I want to be a part of that.
One of the day's educational ambassadors, Averill Park High School biology teacher Emily Kaboot, says the opportunity to interact with teachers outside of the classroom is valuable, especially for someone who might see themselves at the blackboard one day.
Taking them out of the normal school setting and bringing them to somewhere they could go here for college one day, kind of open that door to ask those different questions. And also, we saw behavior students acting we had the 8th graders acting like 8th graders, which was great to see, but they were genuinely interested and wanted to be here and asking those questions for the future.
Kaboot also has some tips to share about how to be an effective educator.
Find your passion and have an open mind, because going through the experience through post-high school, you might take classes that may open up new doors, or you have a mindset you're going to go with this kind of education, but you want to find what your passion is.
Questar 3's Bordell says getting more young people interested in teaching careers could also help fill a national teacher shortage.
Some of those areas that I would highlight are world languages, E&L teachers, special education teachers, and then even beyond the classroom, principals, school social workers, school counselors. These are they're tough, challenging jobs, but they're maybe the most rewarding jobs in the world too. Those are areas that I think I would focus on and say are maybe the most in need due to the shortage, but we'd encourage anyone to go into any field in education.
For the best of our knowledge, I'm Lucas Willard. This has been The Best of Our Knowledge, episode 1756. The Best of Our Knowledge is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Thanks to associate producer Jody Cowan. The latest on all National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter and our flagship station's website, WAMC.org. Until next time, I'm Lucas Willard.